Welcome to Fun Facts Daily, your source for just the good stuff. Monday through Friday, we're bringing fun facts and news you can use, all carefully curated to uplift and inform. So give yourself a break, relax, and learn something awesome in just a few minutes every day. Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Wood, and today we're going to be learning all about meatloaf. But before we get into the facts, let's warm up our brains with a little challenge to see if you can tell fact from fiction. Consider this. When we think of a warm, hearty slice of meatloaf, we often picture a classic American diner in the 1950s or a cozy family dinner from your childhood. But what if I told you that meatloaf, that classic American dish, is actually significantly older than America itself? Rumor has it, the oldest recipes we have for meatloaf come from a cookbook written about 1,500 years ago. What do you think? Is meatloaf really that old? Or is this one a bit hard to swallow? We'll find out at the end of the episode. Now for your word of the day. Our word for today is panada. That's Panada. In the culinary world, a panada is a mixture of starches, usually breadcrumbs, cubed bread, or crackers, and a liquid like milk, broth, or even water. It's mashed together into a paste-like consistency and then gently folded into ground meat before baking. This mixture is the secret ingredient behind the best, most tender meatloaves and meatballs you'll ever taste. Without a good panada, a baked ground meat dish can easily become dense, dry, and incredibly heavy. The word panada comes from the Latin panis, translating to bread. Over time, the term evolved through Spanish and Italian culinary traditions before making its way into classic French and English kitchens. In a good meatloaf, the breadcrumbs are a foundational ingredient acting as a helpful binder. When mixed with liquid, the starches in the bread expand and turn into a gel that lightly coats the proteins in the meat. This prevents the meat proteins from binding too tightly together during the cooking process, resulting in a perfectly juicy and sliceable meatloaf that holds its shape. Time for your daily high five, our top 5 fun facts about meatloaf. Number 1. The invention of the mechanical meat grinder in the 19th century revolutionized meatloaf and made it a household staple. Before the 1800s, turning tough cuts of meat into a tender dish was incredibly labor-intensive. It required hours of chopping with a heavy knife. Cooks had to manually mince the meat until it was fine enough to be formed into a cohesive loaf or patty. This changed forever in the mid-19th century when a German inventor named Karl Drais created the very first mechanical meat grinder. His crank-operated machine forced chunks of meat through a metal plate with small holes. It saved a ton of time and energy and quickly became a popular tool in both butcher shops and home kitchens. By the late 1800s, butchers were regularly selling pre-ground scraps of meat, which allowed families to stretch their grocery budgets further than ever before. Number 2. Meatloaf had a huge surge in popularity during the Great Depression because it was a fantastic way to stretch a tiny amount of meat to feed a large family. In the 1930s, severe economic hardship meant buying large roasts or expensive steaks was just out of the question for most American families. Instead, home cooks got creative with their limited pantry staples and very small budgets. Meatloaf offered the perfect culinary solution because it was so adaptable to whatever inexpensive ingredients happened to be on hand. People began mixing cheap ground beef with large quantities of filler ingredients like rolled oats, breadcrumbs, crackers, even breakfast cereal. The addition of these other ingredients helped to increase the volume of the dish while still providing much needed protein and delicious flavor combinations. The government and food corporations got involved promoting meatloaf as a nutritious and thrifty option for struggling households. The creators of commercial food products like Quaker Oats famously printed meatloaf recipes right on the back of their packaging to encourage sales and help families. By cooking the mixture in a distinctive loaf pan, families could easily slice it into equal portions, making a meager amount of food feel like a substantial and hearty feast. This era firmly cemented meatloaf's legacy as the ultimate American comfort food, born out of resilience and resourcefulness. Number 3. The Guinness World Record for the largest meatloaf ever made was about 50 feet long and weighed in at 6,874 pounds. When you think of a large family dinner, you might imagine a hefty 2-pound meatloaf fresh out of the oven, but that is nothing compared to the world record meatloaf. In August 2009, a dedicated team of cooks led by Rudolf Angeli in Walpershofen, Germany, decided to go big by baking the ultimate Leberkäse, a traditional German style of meatloaf. To create this massive 6,874-pound dish, they had to scale up the traditional recipe just a little bit. They used about 3,400 pounds of high-quality pork, 1,700 pounds of beef, and over 1,300 pounds of crushed ice, which is the secret ingredient to give Leberkäse its famous smooth sausage-like texture. To prepare it, the team used massive industrial meat cutters to grind the meat incredibly fine while slowly mixing in the ice and hundreds of pounds of traditional spices. This enormous cold emulsion was then carefully pumped into a custom-built baking tin measuring over 50 feet long and more than 5 feet wide. Needless to say, you can't really cook that in your standard oven. Even a commercial one isn't going to be big enough. The team had to construct a specialized oven directly around the massive tin to bake the meatloaf. Once the giant dish was officially measured and verified by the Guinness World Records team, the entire record-breaking masterpiece was sliced up, distributed, and happily eaten by the massive crowd that had gathered for the event. Number 4. One of the most famous rock musicians in history chose the name Meatloaf as his stage name because of an incident when he was a child, playing football of all things. There was no way I could get through an episode about Meatloaf without talking about Meatloaf the singer. Marvin Lee Adey, who later became a Grammy Award-winning rock legend, is recognized globally by his stage name, Meatloaf. According to the late singer, he was born completely bright red and quite large, prompting his father to joke that he looked like 9 pounds of ground meat. The nickname Meat stuck with him throughout his early school years, much to his personal dismay. The loaf part of his famous name was added a bit later when he was playing high school football. He accidentally stepped on his coach's foot, and the angry coach yelled at him to get off, calling him a hunk of meatloaf. Rather than running away from the teasing, Marvin embraced the bizarre nickname and used it to launch his musical career that spanned decades. Meatloaf was an incredibly talented entertainer who not only sang but also acted. Of course, he's probably best remembered for his legendary album, Bat Out of Hell, which remains one of the best-selling records in music history. And our fifth and final fun fact for today: those irresistible savory crusts on the outside of the baked meatloaf are created by a fascinating scientific process called the Maillard reaction. A lot of people love the crispy end pieces of a meatloaf, and that delicious flavor all comes down to a chemical reaction. The process is known as the Maillard reaction, named after the French chemist Louis-Camille Maillard, who first described it in the early 1900s. When the meatloaf goes into a hot oven, the high temperatures cause the amino acids in the meat proteins to react with the natural reducing sugars present in the dish. The chemical reaction creates hundreds of entirely new flavor compounds that simply don't exist in raw meat. As the baking continues, the reaction works its magic on the surface of the meatloaf, transforming it from a dull color into the rich, mouth-watering caramelized brown. The sweet and tangy glaze, usually made of ketchup, brown sugar, sometimes mustard, many people brush on top, accelerates the incredible browning process. Now for some news you can use. If you want to cook the ultimate meatloaf at home, the secret is in finding the right ratio of ingredients, particularly in the panada. Professional chefs recommend using about half a cup of your chosen starch, like panko breadcrumbs or crushed butter crackers, and about 1/3 of a cup of liquid, like milk or beef broth, for every single pound of ground meat. This specific ratio ensures that your loaf will have enough binder to hold its shape beautifully without turning into a dense, heavy brick in the oven. Next, let's think about the flavor. A great meatloaf is all about that powerful, savory profile known as umami. You can bring this out by sautéing finely diced onions and garlic before adding them into the mix. This will sweeten them and remove that raw bite. To make it even more savory, try adding a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, a squirt of tomato paste, and maybe a blend of spices like dried thyme, smoked paprika, and maybe a pinch of mustard powder. These different elements will actually come together beautifully to make the meat taste somehow even more meaty. And finally, one last tip. Once the meat comes out of the oven, the biggest mistake a lot of people make is trying to slice it right away. For that picture-perfect restaurant-quality meatloaf, you want to let it rest on the counter for about 10 to 15 minutes before you even think about picking up a knife. When ground meat cooks, the heat causes the muscle proteins to contract, which squeezes out the natural juices towards the outer surface of the loaf. If you cut into the meat dish while it's still piping hot, all those juices will pour out onto your cutting board, leaving a dry, crumbly mess on the plate. By giving the meatloaf time to rest, the proteins relax and naturally reabsorb those flavorful liquids. Finally, the moment you've been waiting for. At the beginning of the episode, I asked, is meatloaf, that classic American dish, actually older than America itself? Well, this one's a fact. While we often associate meatloaf with 20th century Americana, the earliest known recipe for a meatloaf-style dish appears in Apicius, a famous collection of Roman cookery recipes compiled around the 5th century CE. The ancient Roman version was made by combining finely chopped meat with bread soaked in wine, spices, and pine nuts. The mixture was formed into a patty or loaf and then cooked. So this brilliant concept of stretching expensive meat with flavorful binders has been a culinary tradition for well over 1,500 years. Now, I hope you enjoyed learning a bit about meatloaf with me today, and be sure to tune in every weekday for even more fun facts. Fun Facts Daily is an Airwave Media podcast. It was written, recorded, mixed, and edited by me, Kyle Wood. Thanks for sharing a part of your day with me. Be sure to follow Fun Facts Daily on your favorite podcast app so you can keep the good stuff coming your way every day. And if you like the show, please do me a favor and leave a kind rating, review, or just tell your friends about it.